Thank you so much for sitting down with me, President Levin. I think there's so much we could talk about. There's so many issues that are affecting American universities and Stanford, but I want to begin with the federal government's actions toward higher education. The Trump administration has continued to escalate its threats to federal funding for Harvard. Specifically, they've ordered that Harvard eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, also ban masks at protests, among other instructions. And last month, in a statement that you shared with us at the Daily, you and Provost Martinez supported Harvard's position. So what's your perspective now on the demands that Harvard has received?
Yeah. Well, first of all, George, a pleasure to sit down with you. Let me start by just saying something to sort of frame the general issues with the federal government, because this is an incredibly important and really tumultuous time in the relationship between the federal government and universities. So I think the important thing to start with is that basically for the last 80 years, the federal government and universities have had a generally incredibly strong and stable partnership. And people focus a lot on the research funding aspects of that. That is the support that the federal government provides through the funding agencies, the NIH, the NSF, and other agencies in competitive merit-based ways for universities. University faculty apply, they win grants. Often they lose the grant competitions, but sometimes they win. And then they perform research that creates knowledge, that creates new discoveries, that creates innovation. The important thing to understand is that partnership has been hugely beneficial. First, for the growth of having the leading universities in the United States, making us the place that talented people want to come from everywhere in the country and around the world. And it's hugely benefited the whole country because it has helped establish the US as the place with the most scientific discovery, that is the center of innovation in the world, that has the most dynamic economy. And you can just look at Stanford as an example of that. When that whole federal support program started, Stanford was basically a good regional university, became a great national and global university. And you look at the types of things that have come out of federal support for even just a university like Stanford, and what you see is hundreds or thousands of innovations that have benefited human health, that have created some of the leading tech companies in the world, that have improved people's lives in a lot of ways. So, what is going on now that has sort of changed that relationship? A big part of what has changed is, for a long period of time, universities enjoyed not just very strong, but very bipartisan support for what they do, and the support has eroded. Mm-hmm. And so, there's a broad issue, which is that as support has eroded, we have to find a way to rebuild that partnership. And then there's some specific issues, like the one you're raising, where the federal government has identified, or is arguing that federal funding should be taken away because of antisemitism on campuses or other campus issues. And we can get into we should get into some of the details of those particular issues. But in the case of Harvard, that's basically attempting to use federal funding as a lever to force other changes on the campus.
Right. So let's talk about those specific policies, because, as I said, among them are banning masks at protests, eliminating DEI programs, also screening international applicants in new ways, audits for quote-unquote viewpoint diversity. So what do you make of those demands specifically? If Stanford received the same, would you push back on them in the same way that President Garber has?
So here's what I would say. If you look at, there's many criticisms of universities, many of which are voiced in the letter to Harvard. I want to separate two things. I think we want to separate issues that are criticisms of universities that are potentially legitimate criticisms that are worthy of debate and argument, and in some cases we have to recognize with some humility that they might be on point. And places where the federal government is going beyond the legal and constitutional protections of universities, in cases of the autonomy of universities, and those they should be pushed back on. Let me start with the former.
Sure. Which are, you think, the more legitimate criticisms?
Yeah. So let me give you an example of that. So universities have been and continue to be fond of making very high-minded statements about academic freedom and the way we protect speech. And that is a very important principle of the university, that we want to protect the freedom of individuals to think for themselves, to speak for themselves, to take their own positions, not to be coerced in any way by external forces or by internal forces into particular ways of thinking or orthodoxies and so forth. So that principle requires two things to happen. It requires some protection from external coercion, and it requires us internally to actually create an environment where we're fostering, great, freedom of people to speak freely, to think freely, and so forth. If you look at the track record of universities in the last decade or so, we have not always done very well on that front. And I will say, I think Stanford was by no means the worst on this front. But even at Stanford, we in recent years had a federal judge shouted down by students. We had cases where we had a case where we published lists of words that shouldn't be said on the campus, including the word American. We had students and faculty who felt that they would be at risk if they took controversial positions because people would go against them.
Yeah.
So that is one of the reasons. I think we recognized that at Stanford some time ago. I think we've taken many actions to change that dynamic. I mean, this year, the provost and I came out and we said our first priority this year at Stanford is going to be to strengthen Stanford's culture of inquiry and curiosity and to foster productive dialogue on the campus.
Let me ask then, is that what you think is at the root of these funding freezes we're seeing at places like Northwestern and Cornell and Harvard, of course, is that there's been an ideological orthodoxy? Because the Trump administration has mostly cited anti-Semitism, it seems. Is that, do you see that as a legitimate criticism, or is the government using anti-Semitism here as a way of attacking academic freedom?
Let me say, I think there's multiple criticisms embedded in the sort of universities. So I give you one, which is, are universities doing a sufficient job of creating an environment of discourse and curiosity and open-mindedness and a wide spectrum of political views? My view is, and I'm going to speak to Stanford because that is the campus that we're on, and the one that we have some sway over, but I think this is an area where we have put tremendous effort into that. We have put tremendous effort into our civil discourse initiatives. That's partly, by the way, the university steps. It's partly students who have done things like create the Stanford Political Union and create forums for debate across political differences. We have a campus that has a relatively broader spectrum of political perspectives, I think, than many campuses, partly because of the Hoover Institution, but also because of other parts of the university. I think we've taken last year was a very difficult year because of the Middle East conflict, and with students angry at other students, and a really difficult time in getting people to sit down and engage and talk about a very difficult global issue that was interpreted by many as anti-Semitism, anti-Islamophobia. And I think this year the campus is very different. We've done a great deal to get people talking to each other, to get people talking to them in classrooms, in events. Now, my view is that when you have criticisms like that of the university, whether it's anti-Semitism or a need for civil discourse or a need for broader political diversity, the way to address those issues is the way that we have been doing things this year, which is to think about them, to acknowledge them, to debate them, to take them head on, to try to make changes on the campus that address them, not at the threat of having government withdraw federal funding.
Sure.
And so I would distinguish between, there's a set of issues that we should be talking about at universities, that we want to work on at universities, that I think we're absolutely doing here. And then there's the question of, is it important for universities to have the freedom to be independent institutions, to have strong, hopefully very strong support from the American people and from the federal government to support research? And I think the answer to that is yes to both questions.
Yeah. I appreciate your focus on Stanford here because that is the community we are talking about. But I also think Stanford is a leader in higher education generally. And notably, the American Association of Colleges and Universities recently published a statement criticizing, quote, the unprecedented government overreach and political overreach now endangering American higher education, which some of our peer institutions signed on to. There was also recently an open letter to you and Provost Martinez from about 3,000 Stanford alumni and faculty, where they called on you to issue a broader statement criticizing actions by the Trump administration. So how do you answer people at Stanford who are asking you to express more solidarity with other universities?
So let me say at the national level, we're trying to do three things. First, an essential task for universities right now is to articulate forcefully the value of what we do on university campuses, the creation of knowledge, the education of students. And that is something that I am putting tremendous time and effort into doing that, and we are all doing that at Stanford, and also in close collaboration with our peer institutions. And there's a great deal of collaboration on that front across universities. Second, in the areas where there are legitimate policy debates, for example, the level of research funding for universities, the structure of that funding, indirect costs, the taxation of universities, non-discrimination, and so forth. These are areas where we need to engage in a constructive way with the federal government and try to do what we can to help to shape policy in a way that will benefit universities and the country. And again, something we're doing on our own and in close partnership with many other universities across the country. Third, in cases where there is overreach by the government that encroaches on the freedom and autonomy of universities or crosses legal or constitutional boundaries, we need to push back. So, for example, we've partied to 2 lawsuits related to the research funding that we've filed in partnership with many other universities through the AAU, which is the association of the 70 or so leading research universities, the public universities, and the land-grant universities, a very broad coalition of universities. Let me say something about, just for a moment, about tactics. So the view that I have had, and I think the leadership at Stanford has had, is that we want to be, our goal is not to engage in every news cycle and respond to every tweet. We want to make principled decisions that will stand the test of time. And so, for example, and to be thoughtful about the ways in which we engage. So, for example, when the Harvard story came out, the provost and I felt that this was a clear example where the government had overreached, because the idea of having people come in and audit the viewpoints of the students and faculty on campus, as one example, didn't make sense for universities. And so we came out immediately the same day and issued a statement about that. It was picked up very widely. It was all over the national media. It continues to be mentioned very broadly. On the other hand, I didn't sign the letter that you referred to, which was signed by other universities, not because I disagreed with the kind. In fact, I'd said many of the same things in lots of different forums, but because I'm not a huge fan of group letters, and that's really based in the view that I think on a university campus, we should be encouraging everyone on the campus, including the leaders on the campus, to formulate their own ideas and to speak for themselves. And that it's not necessarily the most constructive form of collective action to sign open letters. There's plenty of ways to engage collaboratively, as we're doing on all the areas that I said.
Right. So,
I'll say one more thing
Go ahead.
just about this, which just has to do with the goals of engaging nationally at this important time. So, many people, I think, at this point in time have framed the goal for universities as being, how can universities, or how will universities survive the next 6 months given the conflict right now with the federal government, or survive till the next election? I don't think that's the right objective function for universities. I think the right objective for universities is we should be thinking about, we obviously have to engage now in the current environment, but our goal should be how in 5 years or 10 years do universities establish a broad base of support in this country so that it doesn't matter what political party is in power, it doesn't really matter who's in the White House or who in Congress. Enough people support us and believe in what we do and the value that we create for the country that we have great support, irrespective, and we can continue with our mission. Mm-hmm. And I think if you come from that perspective, that we're here for the long run, we're going to be around for decades and centuries, that helps you think about what are some good decisions, and also is a good thing to think about how do you engage and how do you pick your times to engage and do it in a constructive and hopefully impactful way to help shape the national.
Sure. So to get to that point where the university renews its engagement with the federal government and places like Stanford where people are pursuing ideas and knowledge where that can thrive and that can be free, it sounds like you favor a longer term approach then, something more behind the scenes. Can you tell us a little bit more then about what that looks like right now? Kind of, you've talked about legal action toward the federal government. Maybe you could illuminate that a little bit. Or I know you've also taken some trips to Washington, because I think students are curious to know kind of what is being done in their name, and professors too, to protect them.
Well, I think I am spending, and others at the university are spending, a great deal of time talking to people in Washington, policymakers in Congress and elsewhere about the value of what we do and why it's important for the federal government to support it. So, for example, one of the big topics has been support for science. And if you look at the type of work that gets done here and at many other universities, and by the way, universities, not just at the Ivy League type schools, but all over the country, in basically every state where there's great biomedical research, these are the types of innovations that contribute to human health, that help us have great clinical medicine in this country, that hopefully will cure over time, hopefully sooner rather than later, diseases like cancer or neurodegenerative diseases. If you look at the studies of how the federal government funds science, you will find that the return on this investment, societal return on this investment, is 2 or 3x or 5x the amount that the government spends. This is not largesse to universities. This is one of the great strategies that the federal government, the U.S., has ever adopted to drive innovation and so forth, and it should be continued. So that's just one of the areas, and so we're trying to do that in discussion. We're trying to do that by speaking publicly, as I'm doing now. We're trying to do that through working with our peer institutions, with other universities, and also with other sectors. With the business community, with, in the case of biomedical research, with patient groups, with health centers. All of these parts of the U.S. economy and society have an interest in seeing universities thrive and seeing them continue to produce great ideas, and seeing the U.S. leadership and seeing the contributions that we can make. And so that's the type of engagement. Yes, it's in private discussions. Yes, it's in public. These are not either or. This is a critical moment to do all of the above.
Mm-hmm. And Stanford, unlike some of the other schools we've talked about, hasn't yet faced targeted freezes to grants, for example. We have, however, been affected by cuts to the NIH and to just general federal research funding. Can you talk a little bit about how that's affected Stanford so far?
Yeah, so the NIH has in certain areas of research, has terminated or issued stop work orders or has paused grants. And these are, and so we've had a number of grants that have been either terminated or paused. Some have been appealed, and we've appealed them, and some have been appealed and turned around, but some have not been turned around. And that's impacted a number of faculty on the campus. Mm-hmm. come out with a plan and a set of guidelines to try to backstop the funding of faculty who are affected. And of course, the graduate students at Stanford, who are often supported by grants through their advisors in labs that they work in, we have a commitment to support all graduate students for 5 years, and we're going to honor that commitment irrespective of the grant situation. We'll have to figure out how to do that if it's a large number, but we're fully committed to supporting graduate students. And of course, we'll have to be, try where we can to support, if there's a large number of grant cancellations, faculty or postdocs and others who might be impacted. And so we're planning and thinking hard about those contingencies, I think, as all universities are right now.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, what specific legal actions has Stanford joined on that front regarding research visas?
So first the NIH and then the NSF announced plans to cut what's called the indirect cost reimbursement to universities. So so let's say you're a PI at Stanford, you're a professor, you win a grant, you get money directly that goes to you, use that to pay your graduate students and other things for your project, and some money goes to the universities to do things like to keep the lights on, to pay for the grant administration, to pay for equipment that might be shared by many PIs. That's the so-called indirect cost. By the way, at Stanford, lots of the money that goes to support your research, if you're a faculty member, doesn't come from the federal government. Mm-hmm. So you go walk around all the buildings that have science going on that support the federal government. The federal government didn't pay for those buildings. Our alumni paid for those buildings. The federal government, though, is paying often to have the lights turned on in the labs and for the equipment and so forth. So those rates are negotiated and audited, and that's been a long process. By the way, they've been argued about since the first grant was issued. It's been a 70-year argument about exactly what's the appropriate level and how it's done. So it's a reasonable thing to argue about. The NIH and then the NSF announced they were going to cut those reimbursements very, very significantly. And the Congress had said that's not how it should work. Congress should be the one to choose. So we were party to 2 lawsuits that have so far been successful, arguing this should really be Congress's domain, and Congress should figure out how to study this. So this is very consequential for really all of the universities that do research. And I think there'll be a debate in Congress, and we're part of that discussion right now about what the future might look like for that funding, and hopefully the federal government will see its way clear to continue to provide generous support so that research can thrive on campuses and we can fully support faculty and graduate students and postdocs and everyone involved.
I also want to talk about international students and immigrants at Stanford. We recently saw 6 current international students lose their visas as part of a broader campaign by the Trump administration, after which they had their visas restored back. From speaking to international students, I think there's a lot of fear and uncertainty right now about both their own futures and also whether this school is able to stand up for them. So what do you have to say to those students?
Yeah, well, I'm very happy that the students who did have their visas revoked have now had them restored, and that happened across the country at other institutions. But the whole episode has created a lot of anxiety and fear and concern among students who are here on student visas, and internationally, very understandably so. And I think the university's approach, which we followed in the cases of these students who had their visas revoked, and which we've followed in the past whenever students of any sort run into immigration issues, is we have many resources at the university available to try to support them through Bechtel and through other means, and we try to work with students to find a path forward for them. We actually have a lot of experience doing that because, for instance, during the pandemic, we had many students who ran into all kinds of travel restrictions, and we had to work out creative solutions. And so we've been successful in the past doing that. And if students run into future issues, we're going to be committed to try to provide paths forward. Yeah. Can I say one thing though about internationals? Because there's a broader issue that I think is I'm worried is getting confused right now in the national discussion, which is that just why is it that why are we open to international students, and what is the contribution that they make when they come to a place like Stanford? So first, at a Stanford and many peer institutions, at the undergraduate level, we have the vast majority of the students are domestic students. There's a small number of international students. About 12% of the class, about 88% are US students. The international students are here to enrich the experience for everyone, which they do. We get extraordinarily great international students, and they really make the whole campus more interesting, more lively. Everyone learns from each other. At the graduate level, the strategy of the United States for many years has been that we seek to attract the most talented students from all over the world. And that's part of what enables great research at the university, great scholarship, and it's part of what allows the US, which is a relatively small country in population compared to the world, to be such a powerhouse in attracting talent and being innovative. And so that has also been a partnership between the federal government, which offers the student visas, and the universities, which provide a home, bring the students in. And then the historical pattern has been that most of the students who come stay in the United States. 70 or 80% of international students who come to the United States for a PhD stay in the United States, according to the NSF data. That's certainly consistent with our data at Stanford. It might even be a little higher here at Stanford. And they go on, they contribute to the country in many ways as scholars, as innovators, as entrepreneurs. You look at some of the most famous Stanford alumni who went off and started companies or became incredible scholars. Quite a number of them were born outside this country and are immigrants. And I think we should be proud of that and proud of the contribution that universities make to the country in that way.
Yeah, thank you. In our last interview, we also spoke about DEI efforts at Stanford, and you said, quote, "There may be some things that may no longer be in compliance with federal policy, and we'll have to give thought to what we want to do about those." So can you clarify what DEI efforts are being removed and which are not?
So we'll start here by just saying that, I think one of the best things about being a student at Stanford is that wherever you came from, you get put in an environment with a set of students who come from an extraordinarily wide array of different backgrounds, who have different perspectives, who might have different passions, who might have completely different aspirations for what they want to do in their life. And that's really part of the magic of being a student at a school like this, is being in that kind of environment. And one of the most important things that we do on this campus is to try to create an environment, a culture, where everyone who comes can thrive, and it's a strong pluralistic community in the sense that not only can everyone individually thrive, but we can actually benefit from being around such an array of people. So that is a priority at Stanford. That's always going to be a priority at Stanford. That's a central element of what we need to do to be successful as an institution and have a great undergraduate program, great graduate program, great faculty. Now, you asked about the DEI programs and so forth. So there are two things that I think have changed. But we have many programs, by the way, that somehow that might be labeled under DEI that have, in many cases, existed for years, and they are important parts of the fabric of the university, say the community centers.
Sure. And those aren't going away.
These are elements of Stanford that have been around for 50 years. They're open to everyone. They provide a home for people who have a shared culture or heritage, and there are ways for everyone to come and celebrate and be participant and learn about that. I mean, I had one of my memorable moments this year was going to the Chinese New Year celebration at Memon, where there were probably 1,500 people. all across the Stanford community, and in fact from the local community as well, to see students perform and so forth. It's a great part of Stanford, and a great benefit for everyone on the campus. On the DEI programs, I think there are two things to be mindful of. So one is websites. We've taken down some of the websites that exist around the campus. So the rationale for that was, over the years we had created a very large number of websites, I think probably created with good intention, that generally didn't have an author, but they often had sort of material that took sometimes could be interpreted as taking strong positions on social or political issues. And it wasn't clear who to attribute them to. So you could attribute them, for example, to the university, as if this was the university's position on a particular issue. We have a policy that we adopted last year that the university is not going to make statements on social and political issues. Individual students and faculty can do that, but the university as a whole will not do that. So we've gone through and tried to take down websites that might be construed in that manner, unauthored, or that is unattributed authorship websites. And then there's a set of programs at Stanford that were affected by the Students for Fair Admissions decision of 2023, which eliminated race-based affirmative action. And that applies not just to admissions, but to some things like fellowship programs at the universities. And so we've done a very careful analysis of that with outside counsel and internal looking to make sure that we're fully in compliance with the Supreme Court's new decision, which changed 50 years of prior policy.
Yeah, right. I think that's something that the Daily will continue looking at too, especially in terms of the effects on admissions and the diversity of this campus.
It's a really important issue.
Yeah. Thank you so much, President Levin. That's all for now.
Thanks, George. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate it. Cool.